He pulled a boy from the river. He thought that would be the end of it. But later that night, his door creaked open. A woman, soaked in moonlight and secrets, whispered words that would cost lives. He didn't know it then. He didn't know that saving a life meant he'd have to take others. Two men, two guns, one woman standing between grief and escape. What did she offer that was worth killing for? What did he feel after 2 years of silence that made him forget the weight of a promise carved on a gravestone? And what does it truly mean to be thanked properly? If you were Clay Hart, would you have let her in? Tell us in the comments. And if your heart races for tales of forbidden love, buried pain, and choices that leave bodies behind, subscribe to Wanted Stories, because this one didn't start with a kiss. It started with water, a scream, and a widower who hadn't been touched since the day he buried his past. The sun beat down on the sun-baked earth of Clay Hart's ranch, a desolate expanse that mirrored the hollow ache in his chest. 41 years old, a widower for 2 long, agonizing years, Clay lived a life of self-imposed exile. The sprawling fields, once vibrant with the laughter of his beloved Sarah, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the porch swing, every rustle of the wind through the tall grass, was a phantom echo of a life brutally snatched away. He carried burdens heavier than any saddlebag, scars deeper than any bullet wound, invisible to the world, but raw and ever-present beneath his calloused skin. This morning, as with most mornings, Clay found himself astride his sturdy mare, her hooves kicking up dust on the trail leading to the river. The cool, flowing water offered a fleeting sense of peace, a temporary balm for the relentless torment that gnawed at his soul. He watched the current, a ceaseless, indifferent force, and for a moment wished he could simply let it carry him away, too. The world had lost its color, its purpose, the day Sarah died. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the quiet solitude. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, ripping through the air and tearing Clay from his morbid reverie. He spurred his mare, galloping towards the source of the cry. As he rounded a bend in the river, the scene unfolded with horrifying clarity. A woman, her dark hair wild, stood at the riverbank, her arms flailing, her voice shrill with panic. It was Grace Carter, a woman he'd seen only from a distance in town, her face usually a mask of quiet endurance. Now it was etched with raw maternal fear. "Billy, my boy! Help him!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at a small, struggling figure being swiftly carried downstream by the relentless current. Billy Carter, no more than 6 years old, his small body tossed about like a rag doll, was in the unforgiving grip of the river. Grace, despite her desperate pleas, remained rooted to the spot, clearly unable to swim, her terror paralyzing her. Without a second thought, the years of combat training, the instinct for immediate action kicked in. Clay dismounted in one fluid motion, shedding his heavy coat and boots as he ran. The cold bite of the water hit him like a physical blow as he plunged in, his powerful strokes cutting through the churning current. The boy was further than he'd anticipated, the river's strength deceptively powerful. Clay pushed harder, his lungs burning, the icy grip of the water threatening to sap his strength. He could see Billy's small head bobbing, then disappearing, then reappearing again, weaker each time. Finally, with a desperate lunge, Clay reached the boy. Billy's eyes, wide with fear, met his for a split second before the child instinctively clutched at Clay's arm. Clay wrapped a secure arm around the boy, turning him to face the bank, and began the arduous swim back. Every muscle screamed in protest, but the sight of Grace's desperate face on the bank fueled him. He wouldn't lose another one. Not like this. He dragged himself and the shivering boy onto the muddy bank. Grace stumbled forward, her legs giving way as she collapsed beside them. Tears streaming down her face, she pulled Billy into a fierce embrace, rocking him, murmuring broken words of comfort and relief. The boy coughed, spitting out water, and then clung to his mother, sobbing. As Grace held her son, her gaze lifted, meeting Clay's tired, haunted eyes. There was a profound gratitude there, so raw and powerful it took his breath away. Then, in a gesture that completely disarmed him, she reached out, her hand finding his arm, and then, without hesitation, she leaned in, her arms wrapping around his chest in a desperate, thankful hug. It had been 2 years since he had felt the warmth of another person, the soft press of a woman's body against his. The unexpected contact sent a jolt through him, a strange, unfamiliar sensation that was neither pain nor pleasure, but something akin to a tremor in the long, dormant chambers of his heart. He stood stiffly, unsure how to react, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. Grace pulled back, her eyes still glistening with tears, but a faint, resilient light had returned to them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to repay you. I have nothing, but I want to thank you the right way. I can cook or clean, anything you need. You look so tired." Her gaze lingered on the weariness etched around his eyes. Clay, unused to such open gratitude, much less physical contact, mumbled a refusal, shaking his head. "No need, ma'am. Just glad the boy's all right." He turned, gathering his discarded coat, eager to escape the intensity of her gaze, the unsettling familiarity of her touch. He wanted to return to his solitude, to the safe, numb world he had built around himself. But as he walked away, he felt her eyes on his back. It wasn't just gratitude he felt in that gaze. It was something else, something calculating, something desperate. The next morning, the sun once again cast long shadows across Clay's ranch, but this time the silence was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Clay looked up from mending a fence post to see Grace approaching, Billy skipping beside her, a small, shy smile on his face. In Grace's hands was a steaming pot, its aroma drifting on the gentle breeze. She looked tired, but there was a quiet determination in her stride, a flicker of hope in her eyes that even the harsh realities of the Old West couldn't extinguish. She was a woman who didn't take no for an answer, not when it came to showing gratitude, and as Clay would soon discover, not when it came to survival either. He took the stew with a grunt, intending to send her on her way. But she didn't leave. She simply started sweeping the porch, as if she belonged there. The weeks that followed Billy's rescue settled into a quiet, unsettling rhythm. Grace Carter, true to her word, became a steady presence. Not every day, but often enough that her absence was noticed more than her arrival. She would appear on horseback, sometimes with Billy, sometimes alone, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. The first time she brought stew, the next a freshly baked apple pie. Clay merely grunted, but the scent that filled his long, empty kitchen was a balm. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the ranch house began to shed its layer of dust and despair. Grace didn't ask, she simply did. She scrubbed the grime from the windows until the sunlight poured in, bright and unyielding. She aired out the musty linens, mended a tear in a curtain Clay hadn't even registered, and most profoundly she cooked. Stews simmered on the stove, bread baked in the oven, and the aroma of home, long a ghost in Clay's memory, became a tangible presence once more. Their interactions were almost entirely silent. Clay, a man of few words even before his grief had consumed him, found himself watching Grace. He'd observe her graceful movements as she kneaded dough, the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched a tear in his worn shirt. He'd see the quiet strength in her eyes, even as a shadow seemed to perpetually linger behind them. But it wasn't just strength he saw, it was a watchfulness. He noticed how her eyes scanned the horizon, not with longing, but with vigilance. She wasn't just cleaning his house, she was learning its layout. She wasn't just mending his clothes, she was assessing his life. Grace, in turn, never pressed him. She understood his silences, respected his space, and found her own comfort in the familiar routines of domesticity. But Clay couldn't shake the feeling that this was a performance, a carefully crafted role designed to win his trust. Beneath the surface of shared silence, something vital was stirring. A connection, deep and undeniable, began to weave itself between them. It was in the way Clay would leave a bucket of fresh water by the back door for her, or how Grace would instinctively know to leave his coffee black and strong. It was in the lingering glances, the accidental brushing of hands over a shared pot, the awareness of the other's presence that vibrated in the air. Desire, a feeling Clay had long buried with his wife, began to stir, a low hum beneath his ribs whenever Grace was near. He saw the way the sunlight caught the strands of her hair, the curve of her neck as she bent over a task, the quiet strength in her hands. He felt the pull, a magnetic force that drew him closer, even as he fought against it, a phantom of guilt clinging to his soul. He hated it. He hated the feeling of being alive again, because being alive meant he could be hurt again. The unspoken truth of Grace's life, however, loomed like a distant storm cloud. Clay had heard whispers in town, fragments of gossip about Wyatt Carter, a name synonymous with trouble and drink. He pretended not to notice the subtle flinches when a loud noise startled her, or the way her eyes would occasionally dart towards the horizon, as if expecting something terrible. He built a wall around that knowledge, a self-preservation instinct born of his own pain. He didn't want to know the details. He didn't want to be dragged into her darkness. Until one afternoon, the darkness came to him. Grace arrived on horseback, not with her usual quiet grace, but with a slight tremor in her hands as she dismounted. Her head was bowed, and she moved with a stiffness that wasn't there before. As she turned to tie her horse, the late afternoon sun caught the side of her face. A dark, purplish bruise bloomed along her jawline, and a fresh cut, thin and angry, split her lower lip. Clay's breath hitched. The air in the yard grew heavy, thick with unspoken violence. He felt a cold dread settle in his gut, a familiar rage that had been dormant for 2 years. He didn't speak. He simply turned, walked into the house, and returned a moment later with a clean rag and a bucket of chipped ice from the icebox. He held them out to her. Grace looked up, her eyes wide and vulnerable, a silent acknowledgement of her pain and his unspoken empathy. She took the rag, wrapped a few cubes of ice in it, and pressed it gently to her lip. The cold seemed to make her wince, but she kept it there, her gaze locked with Clay's. In that moment, the ranch yard, the horses, the setting sun, all faded away. There was only the raw, exposed truth of her suffering and the quiet, unwavering presence of his understanding. Then she spoke. "I fell," she said, her voice a little too steady. "Tripped over a bucket near the well." Clay just stared at her. He'd seen men fall. He'd seen men get hit. He knew the difference. And he knew in that instant she was lying to him. A shiver ran through Grace. The intimacy of the moment, the raw exposure of her vulnerability, was too much. She pulled the ice away, her hand trembling slightly. She took a step back, a subtle attempt to re-establish the emotional distance that had always been her shield. Her eyes, still holding his, were tinged with a desperate plea for normalcy, for the unspoken boundaries to remain. But Clay, for the first time in a long time, refused to let her retreat. He knew she was lying, and that lie felt like a betrayal of the fragile trust they had built. He had to know why. His voice, rough from disuse, cut through the silence like a stone skipping across still water. "You don't have to be alone, Grace." Her eyes widened further, a flicker of surprise, then fear, then something akin to hope. She started to shake her head, to offer a protest, perhaps to deny the truth of his words or the truth of her situation. Clay stepped closer, his gaze firm, unwavering. "Neither do you." He wasn't just talking about her current pain. He was talking about the burden she carried, the life she endured, the silent suffering he now saw so clearly. He was talking about the walls she built, just as he had built his own. And then he made a choice. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing the bruised skin on her jaw. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Grace's facade crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "It doesn't matter," she choked out. "It's my burden to bear." "Not anymore," Clay said, his voice a vow. In that moment he knew he couldn't stand by. He couldn't go back to his numb existence. She had woken him up, and now he had to face the storm that was coming for her, for them. The next day Clay rode into town. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was an old man with tired eyes who'd seen too much. Clay put a hand on the butt of his pistol as he walked in, a habit he thought he'd broken. "Miller," he said, his voice flat. The sheriff looked up, surprised. "Hart, didn't expect to see you off your land." "I need to know about Wyatt Carter," Clay said, cutting straight to it. The sheriff sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Wyatt's a no-good drunk, Clay. Everyone knows that. Stays out of my way, mostly. Why the sudden interest?" Clay's eyes were cold as ice. He put his hands on his wife. Miller's expression soured. "Can't arrest a man for disciplining his own wife." "Hart, you know the law." Clay's hand tightened on his gun. "I'm not asking about the law. I'm asking about him." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, seeing the ghost of the man Clay used to be. A man who made his own law. "He's more than just a drunk," Miller finally admitted, his voice low. "He fell in with a bad crowd. Jedediah Kane's crew. They run roughshod over this county, robbing stages, shaking down folks. Wyatt got in deep, owes them a fortune from cards." Clay's blood ran cold. Jedediah Kane. He knew the name. A ruthless killer who left a trail of bodies from here to the territories. This wasn't just about a drunken husband. This was something far more dangerous. "Why would Kane bother with a drunk like Wyatt?" Clay asked. The sheriff leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Because Wyatt told them he had something they wanted, something he stole. A map, some say, to a hidden cache of Union gold from the war. Wyatt's been bragging all over town that he's about to come into money. Kane's boys have been watching him, waiting." Clay's mind raced. Grace, the lies, the constant watchfulness. It was all starting to make a terrible kind of sense. She wasn't just a victim. She was at the center of a storm. And she had walked right onto his ranch and brought it with her. He rode back to the ranch like a man possessed. The quiet peace he'd started to feel was gone, replaced by the familiar coppery taste of fear and violence. When he arrived, Grace was in the kitchen, kneading dough, humming a soft tune. Billy was playing on the floor with wooden soldiers. A perfect picture of domestic bliss, a perfect lie. He walked in, the dust of the trail still on him, his face a thundercloud. Grace looked up, her smile dying on her lips when she saw his expression. "Clay, what is it?" He didn't answer. He walked over to Billy. "Son, go outside and check on the horses for me." Billy, sensing the tension, scrambled to his feet and ran out the door. The moment he was gone, Clay turned to Grace, his eyes boring into hers. "The bruise," he said, his voice a low growl. "It wasn't from a bucket, was it?" Grace paled, her hands frozen in the dough. "I told you." "And the map?" He cut her off. "The one for the Union gold. The one Wyatt stole from Jedediah Kane." Her composure shattered completely, her eyes filled with a terror so profound it made his own gut twist. She sank into a chair, her body trembling. How did you know?" she whispered. "Sheriff Miller. So you can stop the act, Grace. The helpless victim. The grateful woman. It's all been a lie, hasn't it? You saving my son, it was just luck. You saw a man living alone, a man who knew how to handle himself." You saw a place to hide." His words were brutal, designed to cut, to force the truth out of her. He needed to know exactly what kind of trouble she had brought to his door. He needed to know if he was about to die for a woman he barely knew. Her head snapped up, fire flashing in her tear-filled eyes. "A lie? You think this is a lie?" She stood, gesturing around the clean, warm kitchen. "I brought this house back to life. I brought you back to life. Don't you dare tell me that was a lie." "Then tell me the truth," he roared, his fists clenching at his sides. "Tell me why Kane's killers are going to be riding down on this ranch any day now." Grace took a deep, shuddering breath, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Wyatt didn't steal the map," she said, her voice hollow. "He was one of them. He was with Kane's crew when they ambushed the payroll transport. There was a shootout. Men died. Wyatt got scared. He took the map and a ledger detailing all of Kane's operations and ran." She looked at Clay, her face a mask of desperation. "The map is a fake, a decoy Wyatt made to throw them off. But the ledger is real. It has names, dates, every crime they've ever committed. It's enough to hang every last one of them." Clay stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. "And where is this ledger?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I have it," she said. "I took it from Wyatt before I left. It was my only leverage, my only chance to escape him for good." She had chosen him, not by chance, but by design. She knew who he was, not just a rancher. She had seen the way he moved, the look in his eyes. She had seen the soldier he tried to bury. She had brought a war to his doorstep, hoping he would fight it for her. And the worst part was, he knew he was going to. The 2 years of peace, of silence, were over. Sarah was gone. But this woman, this boy, they were alive, and he would not let them be taken. Not without a fight. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, casting long, shifting shadows across Clay Hart's ranch. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside the cabin, a quiet stillness lingered, but it was the stillness of a held breath, the calm before a storm. Clay hadn't slept. He'd spent the night cleaning his weapons, the Colt Peacemaker, the Winchester rifle, a shotgun he kept loaded by the door. He moved with a grim purpose, the motions familiar, automatic. A part of him he thought was long dead had awoken. Grace was up early, too, her movements cautious, as if not to disturb the delicate balance of their new reality. She stepped outside, her gaze drawn to the corral where a large sack of feed lay near the wagon, waiting to be loaded. It was heavier than it looked. She braced herself, gripping the coarse burlap, and strained, her muscles protesting. The sack barely budged. A shadow fell over her, and a warmth spread near her back. Clay was there, his presence a quiet hum in the morning air. He didn't speak, but his hands, strong and calloused, covered hers on the sack. For a moment they stood like that, his body a solid wall behind her, their breaths synchronizing in the cool morning air. The scent of him, wood smoke, leather, and gunpowder, filled her senses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat she prayed he couldn't hear. Slowly, Grace turned her head, her eyes meeting his. His gaze was intense, unwavering, a deep pool of unspoken emotion. He didn't recoil, didn't flinch. The proximity was electric, their faces inches apart. The air between them was thick with unspoken desires and long-buried needs, now charged with the deadly current of their situation. "Do you miss it?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath, a question that carried the weight of years of deprivation. Clay's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze searching hers. He paused, a brief silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the distant call of a bird. "Miss what?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Touch?" she clarified, her eyes pleading for understanding. His eyes closed. Then a slow, deliberate blink, as if processing a profound truth. When they reopened, a raw vulnerability shone in them, a confession laid bare. "No," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Not until the day I met you." The words hung in the air, a revelation that shattered the last remnants of her caution. A wave of tenderness, fierce and undeniable, washed over Grace. She leaned in, her lips finding his in a kiss that was urgent, hungry, a desperate plea and a fervent answer all at once. It was a kiss born of years of starvation, of longing for simple human connection, forged in the crucible of shared danger. Clay responded with equal fervor, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close until there was no space left between them. This wasn't just about desire. It was an affirmation of life in the face of death, a silent pact made flesh and blood. Then, just as the world threatened to spin out of control, Clay broke the kiss, a sharp intake of breath. He pulled back slightly, his eyes wide with a mixture of desire and a flicker of something akin to fear. A man accustomed to denying himself. The prohibition was palpable, a ghost of his past. "I want to," Grace whispered, her voice husky, her hands tracing the lines of his jaw. "God, Clay, I haven't wanted anything this much in years." Her words were a balm, a permission he hadn't realized he craved. The last vestiges of his restraint crumbled. He kissed her again, deeper this time, a primal embrace that consumed them both. They stumbled backward, the grain sack forgotten, their bodies seeking solace and release in the dusty earth of the ranch yard. It was an act urgent and famished, a desperate communion of two souls starved for affection, for tenderness, for the simple, profound comfort of another human being. They were finding life in each other before the world came to take it away. The morning sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow on their entwined forms, witnessing a rebirth. But even as he held her, a part of Clay's mind was cold, calculating. He was memorizing the feel of her, the scent of her skin, because he knew it might be the last time. Later, the air in the cabin was different, lighter. A sense of quiet contentment had settled, a fragile warmth that promised more, a future they might not have. Grace was stirring in the kitchen, the scent of coffee brewing filling the small space. Clay watched her, a profound sense of peace settling in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known existed since his wife's death. It was mixed with a cold dread. He knew with a certainty that resonated deep within his bones that he couldn't let her go. He couldn't lose this. Not again. He walked over to her, his hand gently touching her arm. She turned, her eyes soft, expectant. "The ledger," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Where is it?" Grace's expression didn't change, but a new tension entered her shoulders. She walked to the fireplace, pried a loose stone from the hearth, and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped package. She handed it to him. Clay unwrapped it. It was a thin book, its pages filled with neat, cramped handwriting. Names, places, amounts, a detailed accounting of years of terror. It was a death warrant for a dozen men, and a death sentence for whoever held it. He looked up at her. "This is what they'll kill for." "I know," she said, her voice steady. He tucked the ledger into his shirt. "They'll come," he said. It wasn't a question. "They'll come soon." He looked around the small cabin, the home she had remade. His eyes fell on Billy, who was still asleep in the small cot in the corner, his face peaceful, innocent. A rage, cold and pure, settled in Clay's heart. They would not touch this boy. They would not touch this woman. "We need a plan," he said. Grace nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "I can shoot," she said. "Wyatt made me learn. Said a woman should know how to defend her home." The irony was bitter. "I have a shotgun and a pistol." Clay felt a flicker of surprise and then a grim respect. She was not a woman who would stand behind him. She would stand with him. For the next 2 days, they prepared for war. They fortified the cabin, boarding up the back windows, leaving only small slits to shoot through. They stockpiled ammunition on the main table. Clay walked the perimeter of his land, noting every rise, every depression, every bit of cover. He was no longer a rancher. He was a commander surveying his battlefield. He showed Grace the best firing positions, how to reload the shotgun quickly, how to listen for the sound of approaching horses. He taught her the grim arithmetic of a gunfight. In the evenings, they existed in a strange bubble of domesticity and dread. They would eat the meals she cooked, the three of them at the small table, like a real family. Billy's innocent chatter was a stark contrast to the loaded weapons leaning against the wall. Clay found himself watching the boy, a fierce, protective love blooming in his chest. It terrified him. Love was a vulnerability. Love was what they could use against him. One night, as they sat on the porch after putting Billy to bed, the weight of the coming battle hung heavy in the air. "Why me, Grace?" Clay asked, his voice low. "You could have gone to the law in a bigger town. You could have disappeared." Grace looked out at the vast, dark prairie, the starlight turning it into a sea of silver and shadow. "Because the law is slow," she said, "and Cain has eyes everywhere. I didn't need a lawman. I needed a man who understood violence, a man who wouldn't run when it came." She turned to look at him, her gaze direct, unflinching. "I heard the stories about you, Clay. From before Sarah." Clay flinched as if struck. He had worked so hard to bury that man, the man he was in the war, the man he became afterward, the man who wore a marshal's badge until the day a stray bullet meant for him found his wife instead. He had run from that man, from that memory, for 2 years. And this woman had sought him out, had seen the killer hiding behind the farmer's eyes. "You brought this to me," he said, his voice laced with the old, familiar bitterness. "You put your boy in the path of this." "I put my boy in the path of the only man I thought could save him," she countered, her voice fierce. Before Clay could answer, a sound cut through the night. The distant, unmistakable sound of shod horses, moving fast. Not one rider. Many. Clay was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the Winchester from beside the door. Grace rushed inside. The lull was over. The storm had arrived. He looked out into the darkness. He couldn't see them yet, but he could feel them. A tide of violence rolling toward his home, toward his family. He took a deep breath, the cold night air burning his lungs. The man he had tried to bury was now the only thing standing between life and death. And he would not fail again. The riders appeared as dark shapes against the moonlit horizon, a dozen of them, moving with the quiet confidence of wolves. They didn't ride straight for the cabin. They fanned out, circling the property, their movements professional, tactical. Clay watched from the narrow slit of a window, his Winchester steady in his hands. Grace was at the other window, shotgun cradled in her arms, her face pale but set with determination. Billy was hidden in the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, a blanket and a candle his only companions. "They're testing the defenses," Clay whispered, his voice a low rumble in the silent cabin. "Looking for a weak spot." The riders completed their circle and then gathered 100 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. A single figure detached from the group and rode forward slowly, a white cloth tied to his saddle horn. A parley. "Hart," a voice called out, deep and commanding. "Jedediah Kane, I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me." Clay didn't answer. He stayed perfectly still, watching. "Send out the woman and the ledger, Hart," Kane shouted, his voice echoing in the still night. "Do that, and I'll let you and the boy live. You have my word." Clay let out a short, humorless laugh. The word of a man like Kane was worth less than the dirt under his boots. He raised his rifle, took careful aim at the ground just in front of Kane's horse, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, kicking up a spray of dirt. Kane's horse shied, but the man himself didn't flinch. He simply stared at the cabin. "Wrong answer, Hart," he said, his voice deceptively calm. He turned his horse and rode back to his men. The attack came without warning. A fusillade of gunfire erupted from the darkness, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin, splintering wood, shattering the last remaining pane of glass in the window. Clay and Grace dropped to the floor, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and dust. They returned fire, not aiming to hit, but to show they were armed and ready. The initial volley was to test their nerve. The real assault would be next. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. The night was unnervingly still. "They're coming on foot," Clay breathed, his eyes scanning the darkness. "From all sides." He knew this tactic: overwhelm the defenders, breach the walls, finish it up close. He looked at Grace, her knuckles white as she gripped the shotgun. He saw fear in her eyes, but also a raw courage that mirrored his own. Suddenly, a shape lunged out of the darkness toward Grace's window. She didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared, the sound deafening inside the small cabin. A man screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut off abruptly. One down. But there were more. Gun flashes lit up the night from multiple positions. A bullet tore through the wall near Clay's head, showering him with splinters. He fired back, saw a man fall, two down. They fought back to back, a desperate, efficient team. The years of his training, the instincts he had tried to suppress, now served him well. He moved with a lethal economy, each shot placed with deadly accuracy. Grace was a rock, reloading the shotgun with steady hands, her face a grim mask. The cabin was their fortress, their last stand. Then they heard a new sound, the sickening crunch of an axe against the back door. They were trying to break it down. "Grace, the door!" Clay yelled over the gunfire. She scrambled across the floor, grabbing the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Clay laid down a covering fire, his Winchester barking, keeping the men outside pinned down. The axe blows grew heavier, more frantic. A crack appeared in the thick wood, then another. A piece of the door splintered inward. A hand reached through the hole, fumbling for the crossbar. Grace swung the heavy poker with all her might. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a howl of pain, and the hand disappeared. But they wouldn't stop. The door was failing. The fight was about to get intimate. Clay knew they couldn't hold out for long. Kane had the numbers. It was only a matter of time. He needed to change the equation. He needed to do the one thing they wouldn't expect. "Keep them busy," he said to Grace, his voice grim. He crawled toward the fireplace. He looked up the chimney. It was wide, built for harsh winters, and it was his only way out. "What are you doing?" Grace cried, her eyes wide with alarm as she saw him start to climb. "They expect me to be in the house," he said, grunting with effort as he found purchase on the rough stones. "I'm not going to be in the house." He disappeared into the darkness of the chimney, the sounds of the gunfight receding below him. He emerged onto the roof, silent as a phantom, the cold night air hitting his face. Below him, the ranch was a scene from hell. Muzzle flashes illuminated the faces of Kane's men as they concentrated their fire on the front of the cabin. They were focused, convinced their prey was trapped inside. They were wrong. Clay moved across the shingles, a shadow against the stars. He had the high ground. He had the element of surprise. The hunter had just become the hunted. From his perch on the roof, Clay had a clear view of the battlefield. He could see Kane's men, their positions exposed, their focus entirely on the cabin below. They thought they had him cornered. He raised the Winchester to his shoulder, the familiar weight a comfort. He took a steadying breath, picked his target, and squeezed the trigger. The man near the back door, the one who had been wielding the axe, crumpled without a sound. Before the others could react, Clay fired again. Another man fell. Panic erupted. They had no idea where the shots were coming from. They were firing wildly into the darkness, at phantoms. Clay moved silently along the peak of the roof, changing his position after every 2 shots, a ghost delivering death from above. Inside, Grace heard the shift in the battle. The concentrated assault on the cabin lessened, replaced by confused shouts and sporadic, undirected gunfire. She understood Clay's plan. He was drawing their fire, turning their own numbers against them. She redoubled her efforts, firing the shotgun through the window, adding to the chaos, making them believe the primary threat was still inside. Kane was no fool. He bellowed orders, trying to regain control. "He's on the roof! Get him! Get the hell off that roof!" Men started firing upwards, bullets ripping through the shingles around Clay, sending splinters flying past his face. He dropped flat, crawling back towards the chimney. The element of surprise was gone. He slid back down into the cabin, landing in a crouch amidst the soot and ash. "They know," he said to Grace, his face streaked with black. "Time for Plan B." "What's Plan B?" she asked, reloading the shotgun. "Cause a distraction," he said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. He grabbed a lantern from the mantel, uncapped it, and began splashing kerosene on the curtains, the furniture, the floorboards. "Clay, no!" Grace cried out. "This is our home." "It's a tomb if we stay here," he shot back, his voice hard. "We have to flush them out. And we have to get out." He worked quickly, methodically. He left a trail of kerosene leading from the main room to the small storeroom at the back. He grabbed a match from the box on the mantel. "When I light this, the front of the house will go up. They'll all run to watch it burn. That's when we go. Out the back. We run for the barn." He looked at her, his expression intense. "Trust me." She looked at the home she had painstakingly built, the place where she had found a fragile peace. Then she looked at Clay, at the fierce determination in his eyes. She nodded. "Okay." Clay struck the match. The small flame flickered, casting a demonic glow on his face. He tossed it onto the kerosene-soaked curtains. The room erupted in flames. A wall of fire roared to life, consuming the front of the cabin with astonishing speed. Thick, black smoke filled the air, choking them. Outside, there were shouts of alarm and triumph as Kane's men saw the blaze. As Clay predicted, they moved toward the front of the house, drawn to the spectacle of the fire. "Now!" Clay yelled. He grabbed Grace's hand and pulled her toward the back storeroom. They scrambled through the small window, dropping to the ground outside as the flames licked at the roof above them. They were exposed, running through the darkness, with nothing but 100 yards of open ground between them and the barn. They had just escaped the fire. Now they had to run through the firefight. They ran, low and fast, the roar of the fire behind them and the sounds of gunfire all around. The burning cabin cast flickering, monstrous shadows across the yard, turning the open space into a treacherous landscape. Kane's men, realizing the trick, started firing toward them, bullets kicking up dust at their heels. A searing pain shot through Clay's arm. A bullet had grazed him. He stumbled but didn't fall, pulling Grace along with him. They reached the relative safety of the barn, collapsing behind the heavy wooden doors, their lungs screaming for air. The barn was dark, filled with the familiar smells of hay and horses. Clay's mare whinnied nervously in her stall. He barred the heavy door, then moved to a small loft overlooking the entrance. Grace followed, her pistol in hand. They weren't safe yet. They were just in a bigger box. "They'll surround us," Grace whispered, her voice ragged. "They'll burn this place down, too." "Let them try," Clay said, his voice a low growl. He checked his rifle. He was down to his last few rounds. He looked over at Grace. She was reloading her pistol, her movements sure and steady despite the trembling in her hands. He felt a surge of pride, of something deeper. They had fought together, bled together. In the crucible of the fire and the gunfight, they had been forged into something new. Suddenly, a voice called out from outside. It wasn't Kane. It was someone else. "Grace, Grace, are you in there?" Clay's blood froze. He knew that voice. It was Wyatt Carter. "Wyatt," Grace breathed, her face a mixture of shock and horror. "What is he doing here?" "Stay away from the door," Clay ordered, his mind racing. This changed everything. Why was Wyatt here? Was he with Kane? A prisoner? A traitor? "Grace, please." Wyatt's voice was filled with a desperate, pathetic whine. "They've got me. Kane says he'll let me go if you give him the ledger. Please, Grace, don't let them kill me." It was a trap. Clay knew it was a trap. Kane was using Wyatt as bait, trying to lure them out, to play on Grace's loyalties, however frayed they might be. "Don't listen to him," Clay said, his eyes fixed on the door. But Grace was already moving. "He's my husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't just let him die." She started toward the door. Clay grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "He's already dead, Grace. He made his choice when he threw in with these men. Opening that door is suicide." "I have to try," she insisted, her eyes pleading with him. Just then, another voice cut through the night, cold and sharp. Jedediah Kane. "Enough of this. Carter, you had your chance. She's made her choice." A single gunshot echoed across the yard, followed by a choked gasp. Then silence. Grace let out a strangled sob, her body going limp against Clay's. Kane had just executed her husband in cold blood, right outside their door. He was sending a message. There would be no more negotiations, no more mercy. He was going to kill them all. The barn door exploded inward, ripped from its hinges by the combined force of 3 men using a heavy log as a battering ram. Kane's men poured into the barn, their guns flashing in the darkness. Clay and Grace opened fire from the loft, the thunder of their guns filling the enclosed space. A man fell, then another. But they were outnumbered, outgunned. The attackers used the stalls and farm equipment for cover, returning a heavy fire. Splinters flew from the wooden beams of the loft, the air thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Clay knew they only had moments. He was out of rifle ammunition. He drew his Colt, its 6 rounds feeling pitifully inadequate. He looked at Grace. Her face was grim, her pistol now empty. This was the end. They were trapped. But Clay Hart wasn't a man who died in a trap. He looked at the hay-filled loft, then at the lit lantern hanging from a nearby hook. An idea, desperate and insane, formed in his mind. He grabbed Grace. "Jump!" he yelled, pointing to the massive pile of loose hay on the barn floor below. Before she could question him, he grabbed the lantern, swung it in an arc, and smashed it against the wooden wall of the loft. Kerosene and flame exploded everywhere. The dry hay in the loft ignited instantly, a whoosh of fire that roared to life. He shoved Grace toward the edge. "Go!" She jumped, disappearing into the hay below. Clay fired his last few rounds down at the shocked faces of Kane's men, then holstered his empty pistol and leaped after her. He landed hard in the soft hay, just as the entire loft became a raging inferno. The burning hay began to fall from above, raining fire down on the men below. The barn was turning into a furnace. Panic and chaos erupted. Kane's men screamed, some of them catching fire, their attention completely diverted. Clay pulled Grace from the hay pile. "The back wall! There's a loose board!" he yelled over the roar of the flames. They scrambled through the smoke and heat, choking, their eyes streaming. Clay found the board he'd noticed days ago during his preparations. He kicked it out, creating a small opening. They squeezed through, escaping the inferno just as a massive beam from the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. They were outside in the cool night air, hidden by the shadows as the barn burned, trapping Kane's remaining men inside. They could hear the screams, the roar of the fire. It was a vision from hell. But they were alive. They were free. Then a figure emerged from the smoke, staggering, his clothes smoldering. Jedediah Kane. He was burned, bleeding, but he was alive. And in his hand he held a pistol. He raised it, his wild eyes locking on Clay and Grace. He smiled, a grotesque death's head grin. "Nowhere left to run, Hart," he rasped. Clay pushed Grace behind him. He was unarmed. His guns were empty. He was defenseless. After everything, this was how it ended. But as Kane took a staggering step forward, another figure appeared, running from the direction of the river. It was Billy. In his small hands he held something large and heavy. It was Clay's Colt Peacemaker. He must have snuck out of the cellar and retrieved it from where Clay had dropped it near the house. "Daddy Clay!" he yelled, his small voice cutting through the roar of the fire. He threw the gun. It sailed through the air, end over end, a beautiful, deadly arc in the firelight. Clay's hand shot out, his fingers closing around the familiar checkered grip. He was a gunslinger again. His body knew the motions before his mind did. He cocked the hammer as he brought the gun up. Kane fired. The bullet whizzed past Clay's ear. But Clay's shot was true. The bullet struck Kane square in the chest, throwing him backward. He landed in a heap, his eyes wide with surprise, the last breath rattling from his lungs. It was over. The sun, a fiery orb, finally dipped below the horizon, painting the vast western sky in hues of crimson and bruised purple and molten gold, as if washing away the stark violence of the day. Hours later, as dusk deepened and the stars began to prickle the velvet expanse above, the world had quieted into a profound stillness. Billy, surprisingly calm after the storm, knelt by the gentle flow of the river where his life had almost ended weeks ago, skipping smooth, flat stones across the shimmering surface. Each soft plink, each widening ripple, was a small, hopeful sound in the vast silence. On the bank nearby, Clay and Grace sat together on the cool, dew-kissed grass, their shoulders touching, a silent comfort passing between them. Clay's left arm was heavily bandaged, throbbing with the fresh wound, but he was undeniably, miraculously alive. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining, a silent, unspoken promise of a future, finally within reach. No words were needed. The peace they had longed for, the true, hard-won peace, had finally arrived. The rugged landscapes of the 1872 Old West and the trials faced by characters like Clay Hart and Grace Carter serve as a stark reminder. Even when the shadows of past traumas loom long and the path ahead seems impossibly steep, the human spirit holds an extraordinary capacity for resilience, for profound change, and for forging new beginnings. It challenges us to consider what it truly takes to break free from the chains, seen and unseen, that bind us and to reclaim a future that feels truly our own. We're left to ponder. What echoes from Clay's past do you believe truly shaped his ultimate choices? And for Grace, what do you think gave her the strength to finally step into the unknown? We invite you to share your thoughts, your interpretations, and your own reflections on this powerful journey in the comments below. Your insights fuel our discussions. And if this cinematic glimpse into the heart of the Old West resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales that explore the enduring spirit of humanity.